And thank you. You may be seated. And I will start with a roll call vote. Joe Raffiani. Nothing from Joe yet. Michael Leo.
Present.
Thank you. Russ Hall.
Present.
Anna Hafer.
Present.
Tanya Ludwig. She was just here. Oh, she's present. Jen Hoffman.
Present.
Scott McCullough.
Present.
Brian Yates.
Present.
And if Joe, Craig Van Nice, if Joe Raffiani pops on, will you interrupt so that we can get him recorded for the record, please?
Can I interrupt on my own behalf?
You may interrupt on your own behalf. Hello, Mr. Raffiani, Mr. Vice Chair. You are present and accounted for. And the chair is here as well. That moves us on. At this point of our regularly scheduled meetings, we typically have communication from the public. And with our virtual meetings, we have been putting our communication from the public at the end of the meeting. It can be submitted in electronic format using the Google Documents link provided on the district's webpage. When accessing the district's homepage or school board page, a pop-up window will appear with a link to a Google document. And submissions require a full name and home address in order to be submitted for the record and are limited to a 500-word count. Submissions will be screened and read verbally by the district clerk prior to the conclusion of the meeting. If an email comes in that is relevant to one of the items that we are voting on, the clerk will notify me and we will read that, and he will read that email prior to us voting on an issue. So the first item up for us is the elementary and high school single member district 1 and 2, high school nominating district A and B election by acclamation. And the board shall approve the attached resolution for elementary high school trustees for single member district 1 and 2 and high school nominating district A and B trustee election by acclamation. And attached to your agenda is trustee resolution 2020-4-20. And if you take a look at that, it states elementary high school single member district 1 and 2 trustee election by acclamation, high school nominating district A and B trustee election by acclamation. Whereas the Board of Trustees in Billings Public School District Number 2, Yellowstone County, State of Montana, have received nominating petitions and write-in intent declarations equal or less to the number of positions to be elected for elementary/high school trustee by single member district 1 and 2 and high school nominating district A and B. Whereas in accordance with 20-3-313 Montana Code Annotated, the Board of Trustees have the authority to declare election by acclamation for the such candidates. Therefore, be it resolved, the trustee candidate Tanya Ludwig from District 1 is hereby duly elected by acclamation for a 3-year term. Jana Hafer, District 2, is hereby duly elected by acclamation for a 3-year term. Jennifer Hoffman, High School District A, is duly elected by acclamation for a 1-year term. And Russ B. Hall, High School District B, is hereby duly elected for a 3-year term to the Board of Trustees of Billings Public School Number 2. There was also a letter from Brett Rutherford to that same effect. So the suggested action would be to approve that resolution of electing by acclamation. And again, for the record, Tanya Ludwig, District 1 for a 3-year term, Jana Hafer, District 2 for a 3-year term, Jen Hoffman, nominating District A for a 1-year term, and Russ B. Hall, nominating District B for a 3-year term. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
A motion by Brian, and is there a second?
Second.
And who was that? By Joe?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote, and I will do it by roll call. Joe Raffiani.
Aye.
Michael Leo. Lost Michael. Russ Hall.
Aye.
Jana Hafer.
Aye.
Jen Hoffman.
Aye.
Scott McCullough.
Aye.
Brian Yates.
Aye.
Did Tanya Ludwig get back yet?
Aye.
There you go. And Mike Leo?
Aye.
And thank you. And the chair votes aye. Motion carries unanimously. So that brings us on to our next agenda item. And please bear with me as I'm popping between screens here. Next item on the agenda is going to be the administering of oaths to the trustees. So we will be doing this obviously through the virtual format, and I will pass it over to Craig Van Ice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we'll try this virtually. I'm going to go ahead and read the oath, and if the 4 trustees please raise their right hand and just repeat after me. Okay, so I do solemnly swear
I do solemnly swear
that I will support, protect, and defend
that I will support, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Montana,
the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Montana,
and that I will discharge the duties of my office with fidelity.
And
that I will discharge the duties of my office with fidelity.
That's it. Congratulations.
Thank you. We'll do some. This time we'd like you to come up to the dais and shake our hands, and we'll have to do that at a later date. Thank you very much for committing your time, your energy, your efforts to the students of School District 2 and to our community at large. Thank you. That brings us up to the next item on the agenda, which is the recognition of gifts and donations. And the first off, this is always an exciting time of year. Unfortunately, this is again something we have to do virtually, but you'll see that our 3 principals are on board with us today. We are going to have the recognition. We'll start with senior high, valedictorian, platinum students, national merit finalist, and national merit program special scholarship candidate. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff Earn.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Jeff.
This usually always is a very exciting time of year for us, and recognizing these amazing students in these unique circumstances, I guess, doing it this way. But anyway, so senior high, we have 6 valedictorian candidates this year. First, we have Andrew Bow, Simone Clay, Carly DeBar, Parker Kraske, Mackenzie Sell, and Madison Weber. Those are our valedictorian candidates. And with our platinum students, we have 14 platinum students this year. Carly DeBar, Jesse Dimich-LeVay, Lily Fry, Amanda Gilland, Cameron Leo, Jaden Malone, Emma Martinson, Virginia Lynn Montague, Drake Pennell, Jalen Rosler, Quinn Sanderson, Mackenzie Sell, Emily Cheddar, and Laura Zimmer. And those are our platinum students. And this year we happen to have 2 national merit finalists. Our 2020 National Merit Scholarship Competition semifinalist is Carly DeBar. And we also have a 2020 National Merit Scholarship Program Special Scholarship candidate, FedEd Ground Package System Incorporated, Layla Lorenz. That is senior high's valedictorian, platinum, and national merit students.
Thank you. Hey, Jeff, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit
Yeah.
because, you're brilliant. Since the Platinum program started with you, we've got some new trustees on the board. Would you please share a little bit about the Platinum program?
Sure. The Platinum program students commit, they start their freshman year. It's a 4-year program where they commit to take every AP and honor course that we have to offer in all the core areas. So as a freshman, they take their math, science, and English, and then their next sophomore, junior, and senior year, they'll take the AP honors courses in their math, science, English, and the social studies. So on top of that, they also commit to do a magnum opus project, a project of their passion, something they're really passionate about. They write a paper on it, do a project, present it to the community. They've been some amazing projects over the years. These students are quite amazing. So in a nutshell, that's the Platinum program.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And next up, Miss Deb Black from Skyview. She'll share with us her valedictorian, platinum students, and National Merit Scholarship finalist. And before she jumps on, I want to thank her for years of service in our school district and wish her the best in her retirement. So Deb, you're up.
You're muted, Deb.
Hey Brandon, can you unmute Deb?
There I go.
There you go.
All right. I said all
Now
kinds
that
of
you've got it figured it out in your retirement.
all right. Thank you for the congratulations. This is not quite how I plan to end my career, but we'll just keep on trucking. Our valedictorian at Skyview this year is Miss Olivia DeBoer. And this is our first year with the Platinum program, and we have 3 students who completed that. And that is also Olivia DeBoer, Jackson Ladd, and Amanda King. So we're very proud of those students. They didn't get to present in front of the community this year. They had to do videos. So I've been watching about tap dancing and the effects of plastic on our oceans and how to make an electric guitar. So those have been our 3 magnum opus projects this year. Our National Merit finalist is also Olivia DeBoer. Olivia was part of all 3 of those programs. So congratulations to those seniors, and hopefully we get to see some form of graduation, and we're excited for that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Deb. And from West, we have Mr. Kelly Hornsby to share with us his valedictorian, Platinum students, and National Merit Scholarship finalists. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair and fellow board members. We too are very excited to present to you these students, wonderful students, and they've had an interesting senior year. We have actually 3 valedictorian candidates. One is Ashton Berg, Lucas Hunter, and the third is Tessa Paulson. They're still in the running as we have 8 semesters to determine that. Our Platinum candidates, I believe we're in our 2nd year. We have Ashton Berg again, Miles Hobart, Lily Llewellyn, Hunter Lucas, Caden Moore, Tyler Vanetta, and Lindsay Weber. Those are our Platinum candidates. We're in adjudication right now, so they are presenting this week and the first part of next week. So it's been real exciting to kind of see how they put it together in a virtual format rather than sitting in front of a panel. It's been good though. And then we have 2 National Merit finalists, Ashton Berg again, and we have Logan Zabo. So those are our students that we'd like to honor tonight and represent. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. We're very proud of our students, the hard work and effort that goes into achieving those rich rewards. So thank you, principals, for being here to share your students with us. Now we also are, Russ.
Mr. Hornby, did I hear the name Trayton Grossman? So I see it on the list.
We had an updated list and that student was removed.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? We also have before us donations. We are very thankful for our community going above and beyond, offering their gifts and donations to our district. And so the suggested action this evening is to recognize the people as listed and accept these gifts and donations with gratitude. May I have a motion, please?
Greta, I'll make that motion.
All right, thank you, Jana. And a second?
Second?
Was that Brian?
Yes.
Second by Brian. Any further discussion? All right, I will do a roll call vote. Joe Raffiani.
Aye.
Michael Leo.
Aye.
Russ Hall.
Aye.
Jana Hafer.
Aye.
Tanya Ludwig. Jen Hoffman.
Aye.
Scott McCullough.
Aye.
Brian Yates.
Aye.
The chair votes aye, and apparently a little dog somewhere also votes aye. So voted unanimously. Thank you. And that'll move us on to the next item on the agenda. which is the approval of the agenda. The board asks to approve the agenda as presented with the suggested action to approve. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
By Joe Raffiani, and a second?
Second by Russ Hall.
By Russ Hall, thank you. Any further discussion? Roll call vote. Joe Raffiani,
Aye.
Michael Leo,
Aye.
Russ Hall,
Aye.
Jana Hafer,
Aye.
Tanya Ludwig, Jen Hoffman,
Aye.
Scott McCullough,
Aye.
Brian Yates,
Aye.
and the board votes aye. I appreciate Tanya being available to participate in this meeting. She's currently out delivering food to those in need, so she'll be popping in and out of our board meeting. So that brings us to the next item on the agenda, which is the superintendent's report. And with that, I will pass it on to Superintendent Upham, who will give us an update on the status of our district. He had a meeting with the other AA superintendents, and then Mr. John Felton will be on board. So Greg, it's up to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations to the trustees for their successful election and proclamation. We really appreciate the efforts by the trustees. None of us fully anticipated the issues surrounding a pandemic, 100-year pandemic, but we're holding up well. As Madam Chair had referenced earlier, I have invited John Felton. He is going to be with us today. And Madam Chair, I would ask that he's doing his best. The city council coincides with our meeting, so he is briefing them at this time, but he will join us as soon as possible. And his part in this meeting tonight is going to be very important as far as asking questions and asking and answering about, what does it look like moving forward as far as school closures and so on and so forth, or the reopening of. So I've had a lot of long talks with Mr. Felton and discussing all of those types of pieces. So I want to talk first about some academic issues that I did share with the governor. Please know that the AA superintendents have been working closely together throughout this whole pandemic. Well, actually, it started at the beginning of the year when we hosted the AA superintendents and board chairs, just about some of the issues that were significant to our size of communities and our size of school districts. So it's been very fortuitous as we move forward with all of this. My information, my questions to the district, and it hasn't been complete, so there's additional information that's coming forward, but I feel confident enough in sharing this information that it's something that we need to be concerned with, and it's also an area that I focused with the governor. We were fortunate, we being the AA superintendents, were fortunate to have a meeting with the governor last week prior to his press conference, just detailing the issues that we were dealing with as AA districts in large communities moving forward. In the area of academics, an interesting piece is evolving, and I anticipated this would happen just with the concept of equity, and that's been part of our issue and our challenge. I shared with the governor that we do experience a summer dip. We've all talked about that. It's led to a conversation about extending school years and students not demonstrating proficiencies on day 181 and all of that. I don't want to bore us with that conversation, but what I'm seeing and what's being shared with me from building principals is the distancing between the skill and non-skill students. In the summertime with summer dip, there isn't any instruction going on, so it's not moving as exponentially as what we're experiencing. Now, that being said, I don't think that has anything to do with the instruction or the teachers. It just has everything to do with the ability for independent versus non-independent learners. We know that students who work independently can benefit from online instruction, and those that don't struggle with it. And so in my conversation with Governor Bullock in advocating for us moving forward, what does it look like? Well, as I've said time and time again, time is the variable with this. Now, I know that we have the CARES Act. Our portion of that is $3.1 million. We'll try our best to hang on to as much of that as we can to help students in the future. And the future is a very interesting question with their studies. I am getting some questions on Facebook Live. Do we plan on retaining any of our students? The answer is no, we don't. Their research doesn't support retention. It supports intervention and intervention components with the students. So I'm not saying we're going to wipe everything off the table, but one of the areas that we're seeing is that, students are growing and those that aren't, well, that's going to gap further than what it would normally in the summertime because there isn't any instruction going on. So as far as moving forward and what our needs will be, I anticipate that will be a contributing factor as we look to plan, for the summer, for the fall, so on and so forth. But as we look at where we are in the calendar now, so we are entering week 6 of the closure. At the end of this week, that will be 6 weeks for us with basically 4 weeks of instruction remaining, actually 5 weeks of instruction remaining for all students versus seniors, 4 weeks for seniors. So I wanted to put that date in front of you. I asked Marta to get a school calendar so you can see the school calendar. I think it will help us as we look to what the future holds for us. In our conversation, all AA schools, I'm confident in saying this, have the same challenges moving forward. What does it look like for graduation? Well, when you look at the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 discussions moving on how to reopen or move forward, it looks to me like if we've started phase 1 on April 27th, that we'd be looking at mid-May. So the potential for 2 to 3 weeks of school, maybe 1 to 2 weeks of school, depending on a senior. I'm just putting that out there as benchmarks for us to look at and see where does it place us on the calendar as far as moving forward. Now, when Mr. Felton has the ability to come on, we can ask questions about, what does that look like? In our conversations with the governor, it sounded to me like there would be or could be. And now I'm speculating a little bit, but I'd rather be prepared in the conversation than not be prepared. It sounded to me like the potential for local control could be there. When in fact, phase 1 is or we're through phase 1, and it's at the discretion of districts as far as whether we would open or not with local control. In my conversations with Mr. Felton, I said, what would that look like? The question number 1 would be the simplest, most direct question is, what are the safety factors that we would have to consider prior to opening? Well, social distancing would be the first step, the first phase, first stage of that. And the challenges that come with social distancing, even if we reduce the number of students, which we can reduce the number of students, but mind you, 17,000 students reducing to what? I have concerns as a superintendent about social distancing in schools, even if we reduce the number of students entering the schools. I think that would be a challenge for us. Now, I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't. I'm just presenting information that we need to consider moving forward. So that being said, if we don't have the opportunity to ensure that social distancing is going to be followed to the standard of safety, then the next phase would be masks. And so what does that mean for masks? Well, it depends on the number of students that you have in the schools as to how many masks that would be needed. And those masks would either have to be paper masks that are discarded. So, where do the replacements come from, and or cloth masks? The other part that Mr. Felton shared with me with masks is that masks invite additional hands to the face because of adjustment. And I think of our smaller children specifically, would we be able to keep those masks on them? And so these kinds of conversations were shared with Governor Bullock, and I greatly am thankful and greatly respect his time in allowing us the opportunity to sit and visit with him and discuss what those concerns are, or even advocate for where we need to be moving forward. And as I said, advocated very strongly for additional time, whatever that looks like for our students and whatever means necessary to help them. So, we talk about graduation. There have been a lot of questions, and I'm very, very appreciative of the feedback that we're receiving from parents and community members and so on and so forth. If we take a look at our standard traditional graduations, held in the Metro, 400 plus, maybe a little under 400, a little less than 1,200 graduates. I don't have the official number that we have now with that. And so what does that look like? A lot of questions back to me after this weekend with the Air Force Academy and the graduation piece with that. But if you look at the phase 1 and phase 2 social distancing, you'll see, small groups of people that would be allowed to be together. So that's a question or concern that we would go with. And haven't made a decision on graduation, just trying to gather as much information as we can in conjunction with watching this whole thing unfold. I mean, there are changes. Our numbers are more favorable in Montana. What does that look like moving forward? What will it be like? I mean, trying to guess a little bit in the front end of May. But we being the AA superintendents are working closely with the county health officers across the state. And we all have the same issues, the same size factors, trying to make the best decisions that we can. And I believe John, Mr. Felton, is on now. So I want to stop there. Are there any questions for me as we kind of walk through this? Because I want John to be able to, Mr. Felton to be able to take our questions with where we are. Do I anticipate that the governor will lift and give local control? I don't know. I really don't know. I feel that the information that we shared with him, we being the AA superintendents, was very, very specific into what areas we have looking at reopenings. And so I believe, again, very thankful that he was able to listen to the issues at hand from the largest school districts in the state of Montana. So any questions for me before I invite Mr. Felton in?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jen.
So even if the governor were to lift the restrictions and or leave them up to local people, could we say, no, we're not going back at this point? And should we? I mean, is going back for 2 or 3 weeks beneficial to anybody?
Thank you for the question, Trustee Hoffman. We would have the authority to close the district, to remain closed. But again, the ultimate authority over us is the county health officer, Mr. Felton. So again, that's why it's important. That's why I shared the benchmark timeframes that we need to look at. And then also, when you're dealing with a respiratory issue, and Mr. Felton will discuss this, what are the primary interventions or safety measures? One is social distancing, 2 is masking. And so the science and data are going to be the governing factors into what we should do. And then also, as a superintendent, what I'm sharing with you is what I believe we can or cannot do. And social distancing concerns me greatly, regardless of the number of students that we would invite in. It's a factor that we would have to consider in all of this.
So I guess to continue the question is, would we have to continue every 2 weeks before we gave a final answer of, no, we're done for the rest of the year, we're just going to continue the distance learning?
Well, it's a great question. Right now, we are currently under the authority of the governor's declaration of emergency closure. We can't do anything until he lifts that. So if he lifts shelter in place and if he allows for local control, then we have some decisions that we need to be prepared for.
Additional questions for Superintendent Upham?
I had
Go ahead, Brian.
one, Superintendent. You talked about reducing the number of students. What does that look like? I'm sorry if I missed it, if you mentioned it, but reducing the number of students, how exactly is that done?
Well, that's a good question, Trustee Yates. We're talking about different types of ways to reduce. We could take the alphabet and split it in half. We could take grade levels and alternate days of work or days of school. But you have to consider that families, the variable in this, that families have multi-age children. So we don't want to burden the family where, you know, 2 children are in school and 1 isn't in school. And so when you look at the alphabet, that's a possibility. You look at Mondays, this group goes, Tuesdays, this group goes, you know, so where you would try and clean that up. In the high school, maybe one day sophomores are in, maybe one day seniors are in. We're talking about all the different ways to do that. Every one that we have discussed, and I've only shared a portion of them right now, have some significant issues with it. Because you have to think of the home too. I mean, you know, in thinking about the reopening of the state, we want to be respectful to our families who would go back to work and have children at home, right? That's a factor in all of this that we have to consider as an educational and as a community too. But again, the overarching principle in this is general public safety. And so, Trustee Yates, it's a very difficult. We're not ready to disclose the exact perfect one yet, because we are still in the process of trying to determine what would be the most effective way to reduce the number our enrollment and still be respectful to the home.
Okay, thank you.
Additional
I
questions?
do think that
Sorry, Brian.
that makes a lot of sense, and that it would be very difficult for certain age groups of students, for the family. That would be a challenge. Multiple students.
Yes, it would be.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Good question, Greta. Have we spoken yet to the schools around us that have already closed? You know, Lockwood made their decision today, public.
I have not had a conversation with anyone yet, Trustee Hall, about that.
What are your thoughts about that? I think people are interested that are watching the meeting.
Yeah, I've gone on record and said it's in our best interest to remain closed for the remainder of the year. Done a lot of soul searching with this, and reached out to Mr. Felton. Has been very instrumental in from the safety perspective, because that's the number one question that needs to be answered. Can we maintain a level of safety in accordance with phase 1, phase 2? Social distancing being the most effective. I don't believe that we can social distance in a school. In fact, when I did the interview with Face the State this weekend, I said social distancing in school is an oxymoron. Not that we wouldn't try, or not that we wouldn't attempt to, but you know, if you walked into a kindergarten classroom, they don't know that they're not supposed to come in contact with with each other. You'd be going against everything that we're trying to prevent and are trying to work with our students in it. I just don't. I don't believe it's in our best interest to return to school because of the safety issues that are involved in our ability to try to manage those safety issues in conjunction with keeping everyone safe, staff included.
A follow-up. Timeline. What timeline are you anticipating to make a decision? Again, in the past, we've talked about, you know, we've looked at Governor Bullock, we've looked at Mr. Felton, and I think those are, you know, fantastic. What is your timeline that you're thinking of when students will know their, know what's going to happen to them in the next month or so?
I would like to make it sooner than later. You know, a specific day. I would hope that the governor, in his decision, what happens, I think he scheduled a press conference for tomorrow, if I'm correct. I would like to make the decision as soon as possible on what the remainder of the school year looks like.
Additional questions for Greg? So, Greg, would you visit a little bit about the 15% budget hit?
The question that I asked the governor at the end of the conversation, and I've gotten a response from that, is in the case that local control is granted to the districts, and the districts chose, or the district chose to remain closed, would the funding source maintain as it is now, or would it shift or change? And at that time, there wasn't a response, and I reached out to Governor Bullock's education advisor, McCall, and asked the same question, and she said they are working on that now, and that it would be her assumption that as long as we were following our distant learning online procedures and protocols that we've submitted to the governor, that it was her belief, but she didn't confirm it, that the funding would remain the same. In the case that that isn't the place, that happens, then we would look at the other alternative is that if we did chose to close, and we are confirming this at this time, and I don't have the answer, that it appears that we would be through our declaration of emergency that we had the, if you remember, we had the declaration of emergency board meeting immediately following the closure, that districts would be eligible for 85% of the funding within that piece. So I'm working for clarification on that, but I'm hopeful that what the governor's education advisor is that the funding would remain the same as what we're experiencing now. So that's my hope.
So if it didn't remain the same and we took a 15% cut in our general fund, would that be prorated for the number of weeks that the board made the decision to be closed instead of open? Or is it across the entire year?
I would assume, again, these are questions that I don't know the answer to. I would assume it would be figured in for the rest of the year, if I'm answering that correctly. We are about 65% through our budget. The largest is the triple payroll at the end, but we're about 65% through our budget. So I wish I could answer that better. I just don't have that information yet.
Okay. Are there other questions? I have a question that has to do with the $3.1 million that we received in COVID aid. So we had talked about at one of our board special COVID board meetings that some of those dollars could be used or set aside for the Chromebooks and iPads that we have out to our students, correct? So,
yeah.
So my follow-up on that, because we've talked at length about the summer slump, and now we're having challenges with the distance learning, and you just commented about kids weren't going to be retained, but we can anticipate them coming in with significant needs. Can a portion of that $3 million be used for short-term interventionists to flood into our schools in the fall?
It's my understanding that that is correct, Madam Chair.
Okay. Are there other questions for Greg? With that, I'll have you turn it over to Mr. Felton, and a welcome to Mr. John Felton.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Felton. We appreciate the support and guidance that he's giving our district and our community. Very, very appreciative. Thank you so much. So I'd like to introduce Mr. John Felton, our County Health Officer.
Thank you. So Superintendent Upham and I have had a lot of conversations, as you can imagine, over the last month or so. And I feel for the answers he's giving you, because they're the same answers I give, which are, we don't know. There's so much uncertainty out there. The other thing, just in sort of a big broad brush stroke, is you all are facing the same realities that I think all of us are facing, which is we're not in the position of making decisions between a really good choice and a really bad choice. All the good choices are off the table because we have a pandemic that has completely disrupted life around the world. And so really we're all trying to make what is the least harmful, what is the best bad decision that's out there among our options. So what you all are experiencing is pretty universal. I just want to mention a few things, and then I'd be happy to answer questions. One is I want to go back to this idea of how you prevent the spread of respiratory disease. So this particular disease is primarily spread through droplet transmission, which means, as I think I've said this before, it's the droplets that we all kind of spew out when we cough or sneeze or spit or talk loudly or talk over loud music, things like that. The virus is carried on those droplets. It's then transferred to your mucosa, your nose or mouth or eyes through touching your face or inhaling them or whatever. One of the things that has become clear is there's definite spread up to 48 hours before a person becomes symptomatic. So you can feel just fine, you can spread disease, and then 1 to 2 days later you begin to get sick. That's also very common with influenza. Influenza has about a 24-hour pre-symptomatic transmission. There's also increasing evidence of spread from asymptomatic people, people who never develop symptoms at all, who then are able to spread the disease because they actually do have infection, but they have no symptoms. I think this is where we really get into the issue of schools. Superintendent and I have had numerous discussions about this. I completely support his position. You cannot do social distancing effectively in a school. I've got grandkids. I've seen my own kids. Kids just get together. They run each other's arms. They hold hands. They play. They wrestle. They do all kinds of stuff. All of us who have ever walked down the hallway of a high school see all kinds of interactions. The social aspect obviously is a huge part of being a student. We can put in all kinds of rules and policies, but I think as a practical matter, social distancing is extremely difficult in a school environment, probably to the point of effectively being impossible. In terms of what's the next step is masking. And so I've sort of done a little math. I'm not the greatest mathematician in the world, but I can add up big numbers. Big round numbers in your schools with 17,000 some odd kids and 2,000 some odd staff, big round numbers, you're talking about 20,000 masks per day. So if you're open for 10 days, we need 200,000 masks. Now, some of those folks are going to have cloth masks that are reusable, but a lot of people aren't. So I'm not sure that masking is really either a viable option. You do masking when social distancing cannot be maintained for whatever reason. So I think that there is a significant risk of transmission of disease when school's in session. So I actually I'm in accord. This is not my decision. This is yours. I think reopening school, if there's any way to avoid it, we'd be talking about a matter of a few weeks. I think reopening is not a good idea. The other question comes up is graduation. Now, I'll talk in a minute about what we think is going to be in the governor's reopening plan, but we don't know yet. But group size is a huge issue. Even if you take away the big metro-based graduation and you only did the students, there's probably 300, 400, 500 students in each one of the public high schools that are going to graduate. When you look at what happened at the Air Force Academy, where they put 8 feet between individuals and marching was 6 feet, I think we have to bear in mind that those are, first of all, older students. They're also students who are in an environment where following orders is everything. My guess is if you put a micrometer between those cadets, it would be 8 feet to the 100th of an inch, because they follow orders. That's what they do. I think that's a very different scenario than a lot of 17, 18-year-olds who are very excited about graduation and being with their friends. Again, even if you take away all the family members, I think graduation is a significant risk. I understand the social aspects of it. So my comments are on the basis of what I think makes sense for public health and the welfare of the community. You put a lot of those kids together. My concern is 2 weeks later, we start to have cases, because then they go and they visit more friends and they see their family and their family sees family members, and there's a big chance for spread. The big unknown at this point is the governor's reopening plan. So the basic way that these orders work is the higher standard, the more restrictive standard between the local health officer, which is me, and the governor, the higher standard controls. So I can make a determination that is more restrictive than the governor, and in Yellowstone County, that restriction holds. if my restriction is less restricted than the governor, his hold. So just as an example, let's say the governor said no groups greater than 25, and I said no groups greater than 35. In that case, the governor's more restrictive standard of 25 controls. If the governor says no groups larger than 25, and I say no groups larger than 15, then in Yellowstone County, that 15 is what controls because it's a higher standard. As we look at what's going to happen, and we hope that tomorrow we'll get some insights into what the governor's plan is. There's been talk about a phased reopening. There's different meanings of that. It can mean different types of businesses open at different times in different phases. It can mean you allow larger group size. Again, we don't have the governor's detail. We hope to get some of that tomorrow. Specifically with respect to schools, if you look at the president's plan, schools are a second phase. And when we look at those phases, there's certain metrics or standards that need to be met with each one to move on in the president's plan. And I'm sure that if the governor's plan is phased, it'll be similar. It may not be precise, but it'll be similar. What you're looking for is when we open things up, do we have a surge in cases? Again, we're going to start putting people more together. There's certainly a higher risk of cases. Now, there's two elements of that. One is we're going to do more testing. That's where we are just in the process. So we're going to get more cases. If you think about the math of it, if there's a 5% positivity rate, if we do 100 tests, we get 5 positive cases. If we do 1,000 tests, we get 50 positive cases. But we want to watch that rate. Is the rate staying consistent even if the number of cases goes up because we're testing more? That's kind of the disease burden on the community. There's also a resource burden we have to be very cognizant of. We have not had a huge number of cases of patients who are hospitalized, who've been in intensive care. We've had several on ventilators, and sadly, we had our first death last Friday in Yellowstone County. But we've managed to avoid having a large, heavy burden on hospitals, and so we've been able to control that. So we also have to watch as we reopen and as we get more active and more interaction. Are we overloading our healthcare system? And that includes things like the utilization of personal protective equipment, ICU beds, ventilators, hospital beds, all that kind of stuff. I know that what people really want is a simple line that says if greater than this we do this, if less than we do that, and that's just not the way it's going to work. But if you go in phases, what you have to be able to do is open something up and look at it for a little while. You need enough time to see, have we had a significant increase in cases? So that's at least a period of 2 to 3 weeks, given the time we need to have people get together. We need to see what happens in terms of illness. If we look at the dates, so as a practical matter, the earliest this would start, I believe, would be either over the weekend or let's just say Monday the 27th. If we go 2 weeks before the next phase, that gets us to May 11th. If we go 3 weeks, it's May 18th. If schools were to be in that second phase, you'd be talking about a matter of weeks that school would be in session back in the classroom. Because I know we are doing school remotely, but back in the classroom would be a matter of several weeks. I think it is an extremely high risk of putting those kids in classrooms, on school buses, in activities, all that kind of thing for a matter of several weeks. I completely understand, and as an employer, I'm very cognizant of the workforce issues that come with having kids not in school. So I kind of need to compartmentalize my thoughts on this. From a public health perspective, I think that there's a lot of risk that comes with school being back in session, especially for such a short period. Now, if we were sitting here in September of last year and we're having this conversation, I think that's a different question, because you're not talking about a matter of weeks, you're talking about the majority of the school year. And again, as I said, this is a situation where we don't have a lot of good options right trying to figure out among the suboptimal options, which is least suboptimal. So a lot is going to ride on what the governor tells us. If he's going to act and there's numerous possibilities. He could say it's all local control. Then there's the financial issues that the superintendent was talking about. It could be that it's in a later phase and that decision will be made at a later date. He could just decide that we've reached the point that we're not going to do school. I don't know the answer to that. None of us do. There's been a lot of conversations between local public health officials and the state health department with the governor's office. But this is the governor's call. At this point, we really need to wait for him, and then we'll act accordingly. So I really don't like being the sort of the voice of doom and gloom. I'm a huge fan of school. My kids will tell you that I'm the biggest school nerd there is. But I am really concerned from a public health perspective, the impact of sending some proportion of 17,000 kids and some proportion of 2,000 staff members back to school when we're trying to really minimize the risk of an explosive growth. The last thing that we want to do is go backwards. When you look at our models, we in Montana have been very successful at limiting the number of cases. We've pushed down, we're well below the original projections of the number of deaths, the utilization of ICU beds, ventilators, hospital beds. We've really pushed that down. There are those who argue that proves that all this stuff is a waste. I would take the position that I think what that shows is that a lot of the measures that have been taken have had exactly the desired effect. But as we start reopening, the worst possible outcome to me is if we don't do this well and we end up with massive infection rates and overloading our healthcare system because we went too fast and too aggressively, then we're going to find ourselves back in the position of, do we need to close everything back down? That is the one place that nobody, whether you're talking about public health, the businesses, the state government, nobody wants to go there. And so I think we just have to be really careful as we restart that we're doing it in a way that keeps people safe and minimizes that risk of explosive growth. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions or see what I can do to help you all.
Thank you,
Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Are there questions?
Madam
Okay.
Chair.
Yes, Mr. McCullough.
No, thank you. Mr. Felton, thank you very much. We grandfathers have to stick together on this, and I affirm everything you've said. I do have a couple of questions. Would an individual, an employee, or a student who was told they could return to school, should they have a sense of alarm? Is that alarm paranoia about coming back?
I wouldn't consider it paranoia. I think we all need to be concerned. I think a lot of it has to do with who's in our home environment. So I'm kind of an open book. I actually take a medication that is an immunosuppressant. So I would be much more cautious about where my family members go because I'm at extremely high risk and my family members know that. So I don't think it's paranoia. I think you need to contextualize the risk at two levels. One is what is the community risk, that risk of big expansive growth. The other is who am I going to interact with that I could potentially get a really bad result from. So again, I don't think it's paranoia. I think it's awareness of the risk of the situation.
The second question I have is, if we were to reopen schools, why would we want to do that?
So again, you are the school board. I will tell you from my perspective as the public health officer, I don't have a good reason that I can tell you that you should reopen schools. It's your call. You folks made the commitment to be the school board. I can just tell you, and it's not going to be a very popular answer, but I cannot come up with a good public health reason to reopen schools.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions for Mr. Felton?
Greta, I do.
All right, Jana.
Mr. Felton, thank you for the information. regardless of what the governor does on Friday or whether we go back to school or not, the virus is not leaving us. We don't have a vaccine. It doesn't sound like we're going to have a vaccine by next fall. Are there any plans for antibody testing at this point?
So there are some antibody tests available right now. The problem with antibody testing, so what happens in an immune response is the body is exposed to an antigen, in this case a virus, and it mounts an immune response. The immune response creates antibodies, which basically go out and destroy the antigen. That's how we recover from an infection. The antibody tests that are available currently are non-specific antibody tests. So I can't remember if I told you all this before. I've told these stories so many times, I'm not sure, but there are at least 7 well-known different strains of coronavirus. Coronavirus isn't a specific virus, it's a class of viruses. So the virus that causes COVID-19 is one. The virus that caused SARS, which we heard about several years ago, is one. The virus that caused MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, is another one. And then there's 4 strains that are relatively common respiratory viruses that particularly kids get a lot. We can actually test for those 4 strains in our own hospital labs here in Billings. The antibody tests that are currently available don't differentiate if you have an antibody to the virus that causes COVID-19, the virus that causes SARS, the virus that causes MERS, or one of those more sort of low virulence, typical cold type viruses. So the risk you have on that side is a false positive. So if I got exposed to what I'd call sort of the run-of-the-mill coronavirus at some point, when I get my antibody test, it's going to say I'm positive for coronavirus antibodies. It doesn't tell me I'm positive that I've been infected by the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. So I could believe I'm fine because I'm immune, I have antibodies, when in fact it's a false positive. The flip side of that is if I've never been exposed to any of those coronaviruses, it takes between 3 and 7 days to mount a sufficient immune response to generate enough antibodies to show up in that test. So if I was, let's say I'm 4 days in, I was infected 4 days ago, it's very conceivable I don't have any antibodies yet. If I take this antibody test, I will get what's a false negative. I'll believe I'm fine, and I could go out and spread the virus because I might say, well, I must just have a basic cold because my antibody test is negative. So in terms of trying to understand the spread of COVID-19 through a community, the current antibody testing is not very helpful. There's too many false positives, too many false negatives. There's 2 other tests that are available that actually test for the virus itself. And there's actually a newly released test that tests specifically for the COVID-19 antibody. Those are not available in our community right now. The more rapid test, one gives a result in 45 minutes, one gives a result in 5 to 13 minutes. Those are becoming available, but there's not sufficient testing supplies for those. So right now, the best test we have is the PCR test that we run up at the State Health Department lab.
So my question then is, if we don't go back to school this year and next fall comes, why would we go back to school next fall? Because nothing has changed.
Well, there will be some things that will have changed by then. One is because we will have reopened, we'll have a much better sense of what the risk of spread is. We'll understand that better. The other thing is that because as we reopen, we're going to be constantly sort of determining, sort of titrating our response to what is happening with the virus. Behavior will change. If we have more cases people will naturally distance more. They'll be more careful. Consumer behavior will change. So we're actually looking now at the next step of this, which is how do you live with COVID-19?
But you just said in a school, kids aren't going to social distance.
Right. So that is going to be the challenge. We can't, as a society, stay closed down forever. So we're going to have to reopen. We're going to have to figure out how to work through this. We're going to have a better understanding of what the risk factors are and the rate of spread. But yeah, at some point we're going to go back, and there will be risk associated with that. And this is where we get into there's no good choices left. We have to figure out how best to manage that. It may be that if we identify certain risk factors, that we are able to develop some additional protections for those who are more at risk. So for instance, if we have students who are at higher risk because of their underlying medical conditions, maybe we do need to figure out how we solve that PPE problem, which is easier to do as over the course of a summer than it is over the course of a couple of weeks. As we look at how do we, if virulence was high over the course of the summer, school officials can also help figure out what can we do within the classrooms, what can we do to try and minimize risk. Until we reach the point of either a vaccine, a reliable vaccine, a large enough infection rate that people are effectively vaccinated because they've mounted an immune response, or we have a reliable treatment, we're going to be in this very much this no person's land of not having good options. I think we all are trying to look at this on sort of a short term, an intermediate term, and a longer term. The longer term answer is going to be vaccine and treatment. The shorter term answer is how do we avoid mass infection? There's an estimate that's come out of the University of Washington. That's the model that most people refer to. That says when we get through the first wave as a nation, something like 97% of us will not have been exposed to the virus that causes COVID-19. So in the short term, we need to be more cautious because many more of us are still susceptible to disease.
Additional questions, Mr. Felton?
Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee Yates.
I just, Mr. Felton, I mean, it's your position, superintendent's position. I think everyone that's involved in this call's position, these are very difficult decisions. And I think that you put it in a very good way. And that is that there's not popular decisions to be made. And there aren't a ton of what would be perceived as great choices on the table. And really, when you said it, we're looking for what is the best bad decision. It sounds like a terrible way to word it, but I think it's not incorrect. And when you read through a lot of the commentary, I think it's just, and the comments that we get through Facebook Live, I think it's important to realize and to recognize, I don't think anyone wants to be in this position. I don't think anyone wants to make these decisions. Nobody wants to look at a school year and decide, do we go back to school or do we not go back to school? Can we offer graduation for our senior students, or can we not offer graduation in a way that they're traditionally used to? And we've done it. No one wants to make those decisions. And so you end up with these spots where we do. There are people who are frustrated, and then you've got people who are fearful, and then you have people who they accept this. And you read through the comments and you get it. But I think it's important to just remind everyone that there really aren't a ton of awesome options sitting here that we can just easily go where Mr. Felton, you can just wake up tomorrow morning, say, hey, they decided this in Helena and off we go. It's a very tough decision. And I think everyone recognizes that, our children are frustrated. Every student's frustrated. They want to go back to school. They miss their friends, and a lot of them miss their teachers. Parents, they really miss the teachers too. They miss having their interaction with the students and the normalcy of the schedule, and there's a challenge. The challenge is, and that you're facing, and I guess this is what I wanted to just really point out to people and give some respect to the position. Making the right decision will bear the less fruit. So in other words, if we do all the right things and we see the best numbers in the world, and we make all these tough decisions, it's very easy then to look and say, well, we just didn't get decimated. We just didn't get hit as hard with COVID-19. And unfortunately, they're unpopular, but those decisions have to be made because that is what will allow us to not sit here and talk in a month or two about, a COVID-19 outbreak that spread through 3 of our elementaries, or a graduation that a week later saw these things. So, they're tough decisions. There's no one that understands that more than you, because I know you're dealing with it on multiple fronts in school and business. And so, it's a difficult position, respect it. And, thank you for not choosing to be in that spot today. But I think that everyone involved is just, from the outside, it may not look like it, but everyone involved is doing really the best they can to make the best, safest decisions for our kids. And thank you for all the time and effort that you're putting into this right now. So.
Thank you. I'd say a couple things about that. One is I personally take a very expansive view of what public health means. Public health to me is much more than just the health status of a community. It's the well-being of a community. So that incorporates things like certainly health status, but we're also economic vitality and well-being, psychological well-being, social connectedness, that sense of sort of political and environmental stability. There's a small proportion of people who are directly affected by this virus. And we're doing everything we can to keep that number as small as possible. All of us in the community and in the nation, and quite frankly, the world, are affected by those economic, social, psychological, political consequences of this. Nobody kind of, as you said, sort of wakes up and says, boy, this is a great opportunity to have to get to deal with the pandemic. The last one was 100 years ago. But I think you're right. Everyone's trying to do their best. If you go back, and I'm the first to say that models always have issues. For one thing, they're math, not disease. They are based on a set of assumptions. Just like when you all do budgets, you put in a set of assumptions, and if those assumptions are perfect, it's more by chance than design, right? Because they're assumptions. So all of the models are based on assumptions and what we think is going to be the rate of transmission of the disease, what we think is going to be the virulence of the disease, or how severe it is. But I think it's worth noting that the original models, which were predicated on doing nothing, if we just let the virus run its course, sort of like when I was a kid, if someone in the neighborhood got chicken pox, everyone came over for a play date, right? So let's give everyone chicken pox. Those original numbers projected 1 to 2 million deaths in the United States from COVID-19. Now, if we'd have let it go, would we have seen that many? I don't know. Is anyone willing to take that risk? And if you start taking those numbers down to what does it mean to Montana? So if you had 1 million deaths in the country and a 1% mortality rate, that's 100 million sick people. Our proportion of that in Montana, give or take a little bit, is 350,000. Our proportion of the 350,000 sick people in Yellowstone County is, about 50,000 and 5,000 potential deaths. I mean, when you look at those numbers, the option of doing nothing isn't viable. Do we know for sure that all the steps that have been taken were required to, would we be in the same place if we hadn't done all those steps? We'll never know. One of the great challenges of public health is you have to prove a negative. What would have happened if we didn't do these things? But I think, we really need to be, we need to be very sober about these decisions because these are affecting the well-being of our entire community. And I think you're right. Everyone's trying to do their best, but it is really the proverbial story of building the airplane while you're flying it.
Madam Chair, I had a question.
Go ahead, Mr. Leo.
Yes, Mr. Felton, thanks again for taking the time to be with us. One of the most concerning things that you mentioned was regarding carriers who are asymptomatic. So my first question is, based on what you're hearing now, what proportion of all those infected are in fact asymptomatic carriers?
There's really no way to know that. What we do know for sure is that people can be infectious before they're symptomatic. We also, when you look nationally, there are cases where people have been in no contact with anyone who is symptomatic at the time of contact or became symptomatic within the next 48 hours. So the sort of epidemiologically, that means that there's asymptomatic spread. But because asymptomatic people don't get tested, you don't know what percent of people who are asymptomatic are also infectious. It's one of those things that you sort of epidemiologically back into.
Okay.
Additional questions for Mr. Felton? Mr. Felton, we have a very diverse state. We have over 400 school districts. We have hundreds of school districts that have less than 100 students. We have counties that have not experienced any COVID-19 illnesses or deaths. So you can understand the challenge that you have from a state level for folks that want to have their schools get back to business. My question to you, and I appreciate Superintendent Upham getting together with the other AA superintendents that have shared issues with us. With Gallatin County being a hotbed of the COVID-19 outbreak in Montana, have you coordinated with your Gallatin County cohort?
So much like the superintendents of the AA schools communicate a lot, so do the health officers in general, but especially the health officers of the 7 largest jurisdictions. So we do coordinate and talk together a lot about the concerns. The concerns are very similar because of the population issues we have. So we have more dense populations than those less populous counties and communities. The other thing that we have in common, and this becomes a real challenge, is each one of those 7 larger jurisdictions has one of the larger communities, not surprisingly, and people come from all around into those communities. There's a lot of flow between counties and across county lines and across jurisdictional lines. So one of the things that's been talked about a lot is, should the larger jurisdictions have a different set of requirements or standards or phasing in than smaller ones? And if there was no flow of people across those jurisdictional lines, that might make a little more sense. But the fact is, there's a huge amount. So we all know back in the pre-COVID-19 days, if you go to Costco on a Saturday, you see lots of cars that don't have a Montana 3 license plate. And that's because people come into town, they shop, they recreate, they go to movies, they go to dinner, they do all kinds of things. So that flow across county lines is a significant issue in the spread of disease.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Mr. Felton?
I do need to correct my math, though. I want to get. I actually, when I was going through in my head the from the national down to the local, if there were 50,000 or 5,000 cases, 50,000 cases in Yellowstone County, there would be 500 deaths. I think I said 5,000. It's 500, but still, the numbers are remarkable if you think about the potential from those early projections of a pandemic.
Have you been given any insight from your Gallatin County cohort?
In terms of, I'm not sure.
Because they have such a larger number of infected patients.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that plays into that, if you remember back when we first started tracing cases, most of the cases that we saw were linked either to a known person who was positive or travel. In the winter, Gallatin County is obviously a place where a lot of people travel to. So they had a very large number of travel linked cases early on. Once those cases are in the community, even if they start with travel linkage, once they're in the community, then you start to, you just got more people in your initial cohort of patients. And so you get more. So I think Gallatin County is a little bit different than us because of their winter travel scenario. In terms of their testing methodologies, they've been testing very similar to we are. They've had essentially the same type of restrictions that have been put in place by the local health officer, certainly by the governor. So that I think most of the larger jurisdictions have been pretty consistent in the restrictions that have been in place. There's a few differences, but they're pretty consistent. I think really for Gallatin County, much of that was the time of year and the amount of travel into Gallatin County at that time of year.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Mr. Felton? Thank you very much for giving so generously of your time and expertise this evening. We truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could close out my report, I just, first off, thank you again, Mr. Felton. He's correct. We've had many, many conversations and we'll continue to have them. In closing, I just want to inform our people watching, our parents and such, that we had canceled the March 30th PIR day just in light of everything that was going on. That PIR day has been rescheduled for this Friday, April 24th. I apologize for a short notice on that, but I just did want to make our people aware we'll be getting an announcement out. So it's a non-instruction day, and it's a PIR day. It's in place of the March 30th. Why this date? We did it in anticipation that if we were to come back, we didn't want to take another day off, but as it's been stated here by Mr. Felton and myself, neither he nor I are in support of opening school before or for the remainder of the year. So any other questions for me?
Any other questions for Superintendent Upham? Thanks, Greg. And once again, I really appreciate the relationships that you have forged with the other AA SUPs and that you collectively have had opportunities to speak with the governor. I think we're unique in the state and it's important that our voices are heard. So thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us up to the next agenda item, which is the Planning and Development Committee report. As you may remember, our March meeting was our first virtual meeting and it was an abbreviated meeting. And so we canceled the committee reports. And so this is information that Ms. Jana Hafer has to present to us from her committee. It includes the photovoltaic solar project, CTE, Metro Park discussions, and the Downtown Billings Partnership meeting. With that, I will hand it over to you. Thanks, Jana.
Thank you, Greta. Planning and Development met on Wednesday, February 5th. It seems like an eternity ago. I will just sort of give you some highlights. Is Scott Ryder on?
Yes.
I haven't. Oh, you are. Okay.
I'm here.
I just wanted to, I'll be calling on you for the Castle Rock update. So the first item on our agenda was CTE update. We were focusing on biomedical science, construction, and culinary. We were going to have a nice presentation by the Northern Hotel. They had a one student that was participating in the apprentice program. They had a signing event. The family showed up for the student to start that. I do not know how that has evolved because of our shutdown, but it was a very emotional moment. I know Greg attended, and so I don't know if Greg, if you want to say anything, but that was a very unique thing that we were starting in our school district. Hopefully we'll be able to carry on.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning it, Trustee Hafer. It's like any completion ceremony, i.e. graduation, and the energy around that is rightfully so. But to watch an individual be able to chase their passion, begin their education, and the partnership with such a open invitation and a very welcoming culture was moving. It really was. And the parents were so appreciative, and gosh, I think it was why education was designed in the manner that it was designed. I'm so proud of our district for moving into those areas. We've for too long maybe celebrated something other than that. And with that, it was just a really, really special, neat moment. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. On February 17th, there was a biosciences immersion, and there were 23 students that participated in that. And then in the construction, we are still working on how that's going to look in the future. Perhaps more than just the one house that's under construction. Some of the things that were discussed if we move into other areas were equipment, skills necessary, what other potential projects could be brought forward, and then materials. Those are all items that maybe could be addressed in another setting other than just the house that's under construction. I don't know if Bo's on, or if anybody else wanted to contribute to that. It was a long time ago, it seems like. Okay, so then the next item, I'm skipping the Castle Rock right now. The next item was the Downtown Billings Partnership that was brought up. I did participate at the end of March on virtual meeting. They are bringing their TIF grants forward. I thought there were 5. There were only 4 that were approved at the March meeting. Those will go to City Council for final approval, and I have not gotten a date on when that will happen. The photovoltaic solar update, what I had was that maybe you could help me, Scott. The West Highs was supposed to be completed by the end of April, and the Castle Rock application was supposed to be completed by the end of April. Do I have that right, or where are we on that, Scott?
You do have it right. You are correct. April 30th was the deadline for the West High photovoltaic project. That has been extended. Northwestern Energy has granted an extension due to COVID-19, and it's now this fall. The deadline, I've been in contact with On-Site Energy, the contractor that is installing the photovoltaic system. They are almost complete except for the installation of the panels. All the electrical work is done. The tie-in is complete. They haven't been sending their crew out of town. They're located in Bozeman, just so they don't have to stay in hotels anywhere right now until some restrictions get lifted, and then they may consider it. But that's where they're at right now. They have full intention of complying. They just need the situation to get a little bit better, I guess. They are also the contractor that was selected through our RFP to apply for the Northwestern Energy USB grant for Castle Rock Middle School, and that was submitted today. So hopefully we'll hear this fall on how that goes.
Great. Thank you, Scott. The other item on my list was Metro discussions. Greg had been attending the monthly meetings with the county. I think you might have seen in the paper that the current grandstands are going to be torn down to move forward. Greg, do you have anything else to add on that?
Not just to recap, Trustee Hafer, I've shared the plan that we would ask for as far as our need. That would be the size of the facility, the occupancy. I've also shared the number of events that we would anticipate that we would have. I believe Mr. Wall is on, but anticipate over 60 events that we would provide to that venue. And then the average attendance for each of those events. And so I know that they have expressed interest in our partnership, and we're just working through that. So we've shared our statistical data with them, our interest with them, and I'm pleased to say that it's been received and welcomed, and I think they're just working through their process. So.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess one thing that was brought up is that probably if we did proceed, it would be one bond for the county and one bond for the school district. Is that correct, Greg?
You know, a little bit premature to say that because we'd have to go into the state statutes and see what two public entities would partner with bonding. But to answer your question, yes, that's being discussed, but we look to state statute, and it's kind of a little bit of new territory, but not. Our bond council that represented the 2013 bond through the bond that we have now has reached out to me and would welcome being an advisor in this, and sent a couple of statutes, I believe, that I shared in a previous board meeting on a land far, far away when there was normal life on Earth. Right. So yeah, there's statute to help guide us, but I don't know if it's specific to the exact thing that we would be looking at if we were successful.
Our process sort of got upended, so we haven't had any recent discussions about that or how we will move forward. But that's where we were back in March. Now I know there's something about the easement, but Greta, do I turn that back to you?
Well, the next item on the agenda is easement for Castle Rock area. And I have it that Scott Ryder will be informing the board of a request for an easement in the Castle Rock area, and there is a document attached.
Thank you.
Yes, this winter I was contacted by a representative from VisionNet inquiring about getting an easement to bury and a fiber optic cable through the property that's part of Castle Rock Middle School. It's not actually part of the campus to speak of. It's across the street, across Governor's. There's a strip of land that the district owns. And I asked him to put together an exhibit and so we could present it to Planning and Development, and that went through, I believe, at the last Planning and Development Committee meeting. And so what it is, and you can look at the exhibit and see, it's a small tract of land that's currently unused right now, but their proposal was to install a fiber optic cable on the south portion of that, just crossing the property. Their attempt is to tie in with the area of Skyview and up in that area to bring the fiber optic up and around in that area and create a better tie-in is what they're trying to do. So that's for I guess the short story of what's going on here. You can kind of see what he's after. They're talking about a 10-foot wide easement on the south portion of that property right across from Castle Rock Middle School, across Governor's.
Greta, at Planning and Development, we asked that legal be brought in to give their opinion on how that would be structured. Has that been done?
Is Jeff on the line? Jeff Weldon, he was on earlier.
Yes, he is, it looks like.
Mr. Weldon, have you been given any information to assess the easement request on Castle Rock property?
I remember, I think Greg and I talked about it, or Scott and I did earlier. I think like everybody, I have to figure out what screen I have to click on to unmute myself. Sorry about that. it's not uncommon for school districts to be asked for easements in this case. Ultimately, it does have to come back to the board for approval because the board holds all school property in trust for the district and the students. So I would guess that Scott has asked the company to actually present the easement agreement, which would ultimately come back through whatever committee structure you have to the board for approval.
So in a case like this, when an easement is requested by an outside company, what do they typically offer the school board in return?
It depends on the kind of easement and how much property would actually end up taking off of the use, if you will. But generally some sort of fair market value is provided for easement. Scott, I don't know if in this instance they've mentioned any payment for easement or not. I don't recall if you told me that. Sorry.
Scott Ryder, I think that was a question to you.
Scott's frozen with the brilliance of my question, I suspect.
Oh,
but.
that. Brilliance all around.
I'll email Scott when we're done.
So you're saying the next step is to get an official request from them that can be reviewed by you, and presumably in that request there would be a rationale as to why the district would do that or how the school district would benefit from the agreement.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And including an easement agreement that the board would ultimately review.
Okay, so the easement agreement would go back to planning and development, and we could ask questions at that point and then forward it on to legal for their review and suggestions and recommendations, and then back to planning and development and on to the board. Okay. She shouldn't. So Jana, that leaves us with some action that Scott's going to need to take.
To get that easement agreement
Right.
before
To get an easement
for the next
agreement.
planning and development.
Right.
Okay. All right. I'll get with him on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. All right, and the next item on the agenda is the Stakeholder Relation Committee update, and I'll turn that over to Trustee Michael Leo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to start with the School Health Advisory Committee that comes under stakeholders. That group met last on March 11th. And I'd like to thank all the members of the SHAC, but particularly Karen Sanford Gall and Kim from the YMCA, who have co-chaired for the last year. We really, really appreciate their support and leadership for this group. The meeting on the 11th primarily dealt with the creation of a self-assessment tool for schools. And as you may know, the way the reason we have school health advisory committees is because we receive federal funding for school meals. And in exchange for that, we promise the feds that we will have a school health advisory committee, and we will from time to time evaluate the implementation of our wellness policies. So the committee felt the best first step would be to develop a self-assessment tool that would be appropriate to each type of campus, elementary, middle, and high school, that the tools would be distributed to the administrators or their designees. And then based on those responses, the committee could offer help or assistance in changing particular campus policies or activities in order to better meet the guidelines in the wellness policy. So those self-assessment tools were reviewed at that committee meeting, and suggestions for edits were taken, and those will hopefully be there's no great imperative to do so before September, October. Then the next piece on there would be the Stakeholder Relations Committee itself. That met on March 4th. And we had a couple of items that we covered. First was a review of the Advanced Opportunities Act funding. If you'll recall, the district received about $330,000 from the state for advanced opportunities, 60% of which would go toward individual students' needs, whether it be advanced testing or equipment or tools needed for whatever their particular area of interest would be in furthering that academically and professionally. So at that committee meeting, we started to talk about the sort of the structure by which folks could either apply for some of that funding for their own needs, or if it could be applied to sort of entire classrooms or programs to cover those needs. So one example would be a CNA surgical tech class where all of the students would require, certain kind of certification and testing, or certain kinds of equipment in order to either learn in the workplace as part of their professional studies, or as part of an internship or apprenticeship program. So we're working with Bo Brunsma to further refine that structure and make sure that all of those funds are used efficiently and effectively. Does anyone have any questions on either of those topics?
When you were talking about the policy changes, once you have the policy changes, will you pass them on to Craig so that it can go through the review process?
I'm sorry, maybe I misspoke.
For the health advisory committee.
Right. So there wouldn't be policy changes that the committee's recommending. Rather, it's a self-assessment tool that the schools could use to measure themselves against the existing wellness policy that the district has.
Okay, I thought you had said that there were edits to the policy. My mistake.
Oh, I'm sorry. Edits to the instrument, edits to the survey instrument that they would be using. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. And then the last thing that we discussed in stakeholders, and it's attached to the agenda, were the per student comparisons. And the main thing we're looking at here is the disparity in funding levels on a per student basis between school district 2, and particularly the elementary district, and sort of the average school district size in Montana, and the average AA district size. So as you can see in the attachment in that second column under enrollment, you've got our district first at 1235, and I believe that's adjusted recently down to 11.8 or so, but it's the same order of magnitude. The average size of a district in Montana is 271 elementary students. The average size of a AA district is 5,480. But then if you remove school district 2 elementary district from that AA group, that average drops down to 4,583. So you can see that school district 2 is, more than twice the size of the other AA elementary district averages. And where it really puts us at a disadvantage is when you look at the the per capita, the per student funding. And one thing to keep in mind here is that what we're trying to resolve are these two conflicting sort of levels of analysis, if you will. One level is where the state funds school districts, right? And they've got this formula based on the numbers of students that those districts get a certain amount of funding, right? On another level, the state requires that students be in classrooms of certain sizes per instructor. So for example, the K through 2 grades, those classrooms are limited in size by 20 students to 1 teacher, right? So that's a level of analysis that the state is taking that says this is where education should be. This is a performance measure of education. And then on another level, they're telling us this is how much money you're going to get to do that. Well, the conflict arises when you get to a size of district that we are at, where that per student funding gets strung out over so many students that it decreases that number. So even though, if you can think of it, each of those 20 kids in a K through 2 classroom, they're sort of reimbursed by the state at a certain level, right? Regardless of whether they're in 2-Dot, Montana or Billings, Montana, they're required to be at that ratio, but they're funded at drastically different levels. And if you can just look at the bottom column where we look at, so we've got the average Montana district size and the A and B, they're receiving approximately $5,000, almost $5,600 per student. In Billings Public Schools, excuse me, we're receiving $4,133. So that's a difference of $1,400 per student between that average and what we're actually getting. Yet, we have to create the same classroom sizes that are required by state law. We have to adhere to those numbers, and there are fixed costs associated with that, right? We have to pay folks on basically this classroom model, but we're not reimbursed from the state on that same model. So you can see the disparity where if we look at the AA districts, when you pull out school district 2, the difference for them is only about $150 per student between them and the average Montana school size, right? But for us, it goes up to over $1,400 per student. And that's where we really, that I think is the source of what we're struggling with now on a budgetary level. We are required to create certain types of learning environments that have certain fixed costs to them, but as our district size grows, that reimbursement level is effectively shrunk. So I think it underlines 2 calls to action. One is to, in the next session at the state, make this clear to our legislators and particularly our delegation in Yellowstone County to work towards a more equitable reimbursement and funding of education in the state. And 2, it really underlines the fact that we need to support the elementary levy when it comes up for a vote this summer. It's very difficult for us to go to our leaders in the state and ask for additional support if our community itself is not willing to pass those basic levies. So I'd urge everyone to work hard to educate the voters here in Yellowstone County, educate our elected representatives, and let them know that in order for our students to receive an equitable education that's required under the state constitution, we need to push for those two things: the passage of the levy and some kind of a reform at the state level for those funding formulas. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any questions of Mike?
Madam Chair,
Go ahead, Brian.
just Mike, I asked, a few months ago, I had questions about when you were talking about the funding formula and the decrement and how different things worked. And I think this is actually really, this is a great piece you put together because it displays it very, very well, what being our size looks like and what it does to our funding. And I think it's great that it gets out there and that more and more people understand it. And every time that you continue to explain this, I think it really helps what we're trying to do and to pass the levies, but also to understand, just like you said, we need to understand the current situation so that when the legislature does come around, we do understand it's something that everyone really needs to get involved with so that we don't continue to talk about the same frustration. So without a solution. And so, I mean, I think this is a great visualization. And when you look at those numbers, wow, that's a huge hill that we have to work up against. And so, yeah, it's a great visualization. Thanks, Mike.
Any other questions or comments? Another way that we can also share with our legislative leaders and our community, Craig Van Ice worked up some of the data, and it showed that 90% of our elementary students and 90% of our high school students were funded at the lowest level of A and B, annual number of belonging, which is shocking. So with that, Mike, do you have anything else to add?
The only other thing I'd like to underline as well, and I don't have the numbers on this yet, but it's the relative efficiency of our administration. Everybody points to the big budget numbers that we have, but I'm going to be working with MTSBA a little bit more to get at these numbers. But when you think about the administrative overhead for all of these smaller districts in Montana, that are between 100 maybe and 500 students in an elementary district, the proportion of their funding that goes to administration is going to be relatively large. When we talk about efficiency, in Yellowstone County, we have 2 school districts that are run by one superintendent and an administrative staff. And when you spread that out over those students, I think that gives us one of the most administratively efficient districts in the state. And it makes an argument for looking at the proportion of administrative costs to overall education. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next few months. So thanks again.
Thanks, Mike. That moves us on to our next agenda item, which is the Performance and Monitoring Committee report. And they reviewed elementary and middle school benchmarking data for the winter 2019-20 testing term. And I will pass that on to Russ Hall.
Okay, thanks, Greta. So we met, actually it's been a while ago now, but talked about the winter test results. And, what we focused on, and I'll turn the time over to Roger here very shortly. Once again, he and his team have done a great job of breaking down the results and then putting, very great meaning assigned to the results, but also providing it's easily to dissect it, to see what percent of kids in the district are proficient and nearing proficiency or not proficient. And when you scroll down, so I'm on the packet, and he'll get to it, but when we look down at page 39 of the packet, when we get into percentage change. That's what, we spent quite a bit of time on that as we look through the percent of change, whether it's positive or negative, and, kind of just talked about why might some of those things happen. And we don't have the answers, but it was definitely an interesting conversation. And in the future, I would love to have, some of our teachers or administrators from the schools who had a great change in proficiency, from fall to winter, to brainstorm, to get some ideas of what are they doing that's different. And we talked with Brenda Koch about the PLCs and whether or not they were sharing this information, across the district, and they are. So, one school, when they're doing well, they're sharing ideas, and if a school, might be performing, poorly, worse than expected, definitely they're talking to others and getting ideas. And so that was something from an overall perspective that I thought was a really fascinating discussion. So with that, Roger, turn the time over to you. Walk us through the great information that you have for us.
Thank you, Russ. So just to summarize, just wanted to focus on some of the changes in percentages from fall to winter. And just keep in mind, most of this assessment data was collected in December or early January. So a few months, it's a little bit older, but it's the most recent data we have on our students. And looking at kindergarten, we saw a 10% improvement in the percentage of students meeting the benchmark. So 57% of our students are hitting the benchmark now. We started the year at 48. So with some rounding, there was about a 10% improvement. In first grade, we saw a 3% improvement. And just to kind of focus on some of those highlights, we saw at Highland Elementary and Kindergarten, 33% improvement from the fall. So they're at 78% of their students in kindergarten hitting the benchmark, starting the year out with 44. So a tremendous growth there. Washington Elementary, another one to point out for kindergarten. We had, a 30% improvement for them. They have 60% of their students hitting the benchmark. Alkali, Big Sky are also up there in the high 20s. First grade reading, we saw a 3% improvement as a district, like I mentioned. Arrowhead, Burlington, Orchard all came in very strong with pretty significant growth. So like Trustee Hall mentioned, those would probably be schools that will work with our leadership support to talk through at the PLC time what's worked and what we can share. At second grade, I apologize. I thought we had the correct attachments with the district level numbers added in there, but I don't know if that made it into the right packet for you guys. But in the fall, we had 49% of our students hitting the benchmark in second grade reading, and we grew 4% and are at 53%. And then if you look at the summary for that second grade, some highlights included Washington again, Miles Avenue, and Bitterroot. So not necessarily are some of our more needier schools are certainly making that growth that we want to see with our students. Moving over to third through eighth grade, looking at some summary information. As a district, 5% improvement in third grade reading. Fourth grade, we had a 6% improvement. Fifth grade, a 5%. And then in middle school, we dropped 2% for sixth grade, and we increased by 1% in eighth grade. We don't include our seventh grade data this time because of they used the ACT Aspire this year, so that there's kind of a gap in the information there, but that'll be something we present later down the road. And then there's, again, quite a bit of information to share there throughout the packet, where you can see by grade level, by building, the percentage of change there on readings. Any questions so far? Yep.
I have a question. This is Jen Hoffman. And so where's the benchmark coming from?
I'm sorry, my connection cut out a bit. You asked about where the benchmark's coming from?
Yeah, so what are we're looking at the proficiency and you're talking about the benchmark. What's the benchmark? Where's that coming from? Does
Sure.
that make sense?
So I'll start with K through 2. We use FastBridge assessments, and that's normative data that we're looking at. So they have millions of students across the country, across the world take these assessments, and they look at the norming of that. So in that system, we look at about the 40th percentile. So if we lined up 100 kids in a row and you line them up from lowest achieving to highest achieving, the 40th kid would kind of be the benchmark we want our students to meet. So whatever they achieved. And so when we look at our information, we're looking at about that percentage, that normative level moving up to be benchmarked. So it's not necessarily 40% correct on the test. It's just the norming process. When we look at 3rd through 8th grade, we use NWEA assessments, and they do a lot of research to support students to take that test and compare that to how they do on the state assessment. And in our case, that's the Smarter Balance Assessment, which is given 20 to 25 states have adopted that system. So they look at students that took both assessments and they correlate the two together. And they kind of say, if you're scoring at this mark on our assessment at this time of year and this grade level, you're likely going to be proficient on that state assessment. And to kind of put them to simpler terms, I don't know if I had the slide in this presentation, but we had the normative data would probably put you at about the 60th to 70th percentile level. So if you ranked those students from 1 to 100 in a row, you're looking at the student who's about 60th in line or 70th. So the top 30 to 40 students, relatively speaking, if you looked at just a sample of 100. So did that answer the question for you?
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to switch gears to math and just summarize a little bit there. Looking at kindergarten, we saw some great growth again. We had a 12% improvement. So started the year with 61% of our kindergartners hitting the benchmark at that time. And then at winter, 73% of them hit the benchmark. So that's really indicative of a pretty healthy system. What we're doing is working. If just tier 1 programming and curriculum is meeting the needs of that many students. So not to mention our interventions and else coming into play there, but when you can have that high of a percentage in the district that's our size, that's something to celebrate. Some highlights for kindergarten math: Big Sky, Alkali Creek, McKinley, Broadwater on our chart. So just a shout out to McKinley, they had 48% of their students in the benchmark in kindergarten, and in the winter they hit 73%. So right at the district average for one of our higher need schools. So certainly need to celebrate their work and effort there. Broadwater, same thing. Another title school, 17% starting the year, up to 51%. So tremendous growth on their part. In first grade, in early math, we saw as a district 7% improvement. And again, that's our total. 75% of our students are hitting that benchmark at the winter time in math. And some celebrations there: Burlington, Arrowhead, Bench, McKinley again, and Miles Avenue. In second grade math, and again, I apologize, this line didn't make it over in your charts, but we started the year with 71% of our students hitting benchmark, and we grew 1%, so 72 now as a district. And some of the similar schools we mentioned earlier making quite a bit of growth from fall to spring. Holly Drive, Rose Park, Orchard, Miles Avenue second grade, Big Sky second grade. So it's exciting to see this kind of growth and kind of movement from fall to winter. And I think we're really excited to see where we would end up at the end of the year. But obviously, as things have taken their toll here, we're not sure we're going to be able to have that information to look at. So looking at math for third grade, fourth, fifth, sixth, and eighth grade. Third grade, we saw a pretty significant change from fall to winter on NWA scores, an 8% improvement, and that's significant. And like I mentioned to Trustee Hoffman's question, the bar is quite a bit higher on this assessment system. So we wanted it to correlate to our state assessment. So when you think of the normative percentiles, hitting the 60th percentile or 70th percentile in a normative study is pretty difficult. So seeing that kind of movement is something to celebrate. Fourth grade, we dropped 1%. Fifth grade up 3%, and then middle school kind of mirrored what we saw in reading. Sixth grade went down 5%, and eighth grade went up 4%. So you could see the breakdowns by building and by grade level there in your attachments too. But that was essentially kind of what we discussed. It was more looking at the percentage of change from fall to winter at our committee meeting back in March, and kind of talking about next steps and looking to see how we can share out the celebrations and successes with our staff in the district.
Thanks, Roger. Any questions?
Yeah, I had a question for us. Roger, for that sixth grade decline of 5%, were there any discussions in the PLCs for those grade levels as to what may have accounted for that?
I haven't spent much time with the sixth grade PLCs at the middle schools, honestly, so I couldn't really address that personally. I don't know if anybody else was on the meeting that could speak to that.
You know, Mike, something that we talked about, we didn't have any evidence, but when you look at that change, is there something, you know, from fifth grade? I don't know. We were just talking about is there from fifth grade to sixth grade? So they came in at what 39%, and then dropped to 34%. So what's the connection between elementary school and middle school? So just an interesting thought that we don't have an answer to. It's something we discussed.
One thing that did come to mind. One thing we did differently this year was we moved our testing dates up a little bit. So we tested in December, and typically our middle schools are, most of them tested in January in previous years, but we needed to tighten up some of our testing calendar. So there likely was less instruction happening at the time of testing. So that could very well influence how our students are going to show mastery at that point in the year.
Trustee Leo, too, in response to that, when we move from fifth grade to sixth grade, you're moving from one classroom, one teacher in fifth grade to multiple classrooms, multiple teachers in sixth grade. So there's times that you lose the amount of instruction that you may be getting in your group work in elementary school versus middle school, which I believe is a contributing factor, because it's not an anomaly that we're looking at here. I've seen that happen in my career, where you do see a dip from fifth to sixth grade, and you ask the question, why? Well, a portion of it is moving from a one classroom, one teacher with multiple supports to multiple classrooms, multiple teachers with less intervention time. So it comes back to some of the intervention issues that we face. And, you know, with the budget cut that we went through, remember, there were 11 interventionists that were identified in that are specific to adding time to students' learning, which is why I called one of the reasons I called the funding formula into question. So that's a contributing factor to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. And it looks like those drops are pretty much across the board for all the middle schools. So, and I guess the earlier testing, I don't know how many on average, like Roger, how many questions would a 5% change indicate, right? That's maybe 2 or 3 questions or something like that. You know,
That's a really hard question to answer with,
right.
with NWA map testing, but because it's actually designed for our students to miss half of them. So because it's an adaptive test, so it's going to get harder and easier depending on how they respond, and it's designed for them to miss them. Actually, that's how we know where they've ended up. So,
okay. Yeah, but I could see if you give it a month earlier, whatever, you know, could have occurred in that month that you lose, that could certainly account for some of it at least. But thanks a lot.
So I guess a question for you, Roger, because we haven't had a meeting to talk about it. Assuming that we're not going back to school, which then the testing that would have happened in spring most likely won't happen. So what are some thoughts? And we haven't had this conversation before. I hadn't thought about it until tonight. What are some thoughts about what do we do, and what are the impacts for if we don't have that spring testing data?
Yeah, you know, that like this is unprecedented in a sense, and I know I've signed up for some webinars with our vendors here to kind of talk us through that, to kind of provide some guidance about what potential loss we could be seeing. The great thing about MAP and NWA is that we have a continuum of scores from year to year that we can compare through our students. So when we come back, hopefully this, you know, if it's not this spring and in the fall, we can certainly see where they're at and use that information to adjust what we need to adjust. So that's one piece of the puzzle. So, but really, and just to kind of reiterate what our superintendent has said, it's really going to be the expertise of our teachers who know our students to really contribute to that conversation about mastery and proficiency-based information. So this is part of the puzzle. We can certainly use it, and we'll definitely rely on it probably a lot more heavily in the fall when we assess our students, to kind of see what kind of gaps there could be or drops that have happened since then. But it's kind of nebulous in a way to think about what could our students achieve if we did open up this spring and tested them, or if we have to wait all the way to fall and how that's going to look. So more information to come, definitely, and I certainly look forward to learning from the experts in the field about some of this growth information and how this pause on our schooling system, or at least in the classroom, you know, going to distance learning, how that's going to affect us potentially.
Right. It'll be interesting too to see if they'll come up with some sort of a pulse, you know, check, something either, you know, during the summer at the very beginning of the year, some quick little pulse survey, pulse test. What sort of creative means might there be? Because yeah, this will be a huge loss for the data, right? So we have all this data that has been collected over the years. So it'll just be interesting to see this blip. But anyhow, well, any other questions for Roger? Great. Okay, thanks, Roger. Appreciate what you guys do.
Thank you.
And that concludes your report?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, that moves us on to curriculum and instruction report. And with that, per board policy 2120 and ARM requirements, the workplace experience credit has finished the 30-day review with no public comment and will be moved forward by way of the consent agenda. And Dr. Olszewski will speak to that.
Madam Chair, just really quick, Bo and I had presented for first read in the February school board meeting a request for approval or for first read for that credit proposal, and we have not received any public comment, concerns, or questions over the period of time of that 30-day review. And so we're putting that through to the consent agenda for consideration for approval from the school board.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, thanks, Chris. And that brings us to the budget updates with Craig Van Nuys. Mr. Van Nuys.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So attach the general fund forecast view that we've been looking at since January. Last month, because of the timing of the March board meeting, we didn't have February numbers finalized. We had what we thought would be estimates. So I had plopped estimates for February in. And then out of that meeting last month, Trustee Hall had requested view of just a comparison of how are we trending, when our actuals come through versus what we were forecasting at the time. So I added the comparison for the months of January and February down below in this spreadsheet. So this shows what our actuals came in at versus what we were forecasting for those months in the January timeframe. You'll hear as we go through these, on a month-to-month basis, if we have some variances, some of that's related to timing. We have a big purchase in the school district, a little different than gap accounting in the commercial world, where you may be able to spread that expense across 12 months, say if it's a 12-month lease. In the school district, once you pay the expense, you just incur that cost included in your actuals for that given month. So it makes it a bit more difficult just because of that timing to be precise every month. But again, as these actuals come in, we continue to update our forecasted amounts in future months to adjust for that timing. So again, I've got the January, February comparisons on here. And then as it relates to March actuals, so March actuals got finalized late last week, and I was anxious to see what those look like, just considering, we have half a month of March in a shutdown scenario. And so I've started to look through and dissect those March actuals a bit. Wasn't ready to present them to the board tonight just because we need to go through, do diligence on those numbers, understand exactly what we're seeing before we chalk up any savings due to a shutdown scenario. But when I was looking at those March actuals, the one area I wanted to focus on just to see if we were seeing an impact was on our utilities. And that one seems like a no-brainer. If your buildings are empty and you're not heating them as much as you might be, or running the lights or any of that, or even your water usage, we would expect those to be lower. And we did see some reduction in utility costs, at least in terms of what hit our March actuals. But part of what myself and the business office team will be doing this week is, again, dissecting those March actuals, making sure we understand what was true savings due to the shutdown and what might just be anomalies that we shouldn't necessarily chalk up to true savings. And the hope, so by the time we're meeting at the board meeting, we'll have March actuals for the board to look at, potentially some April estimates at that point. But we'll be able to speak clearly to, okay, here are the impacts of the shutdown. Here's where we're seeing some of those savings. And alternatively, if we're incurring some extra expenses, we want to be able to call those out as well. So again, just for this month, not including those March actuals, but once we get through another month and have a chance to dissect those numbers, we should have a better view for the board next month of what the shutdown, what kind of fiscal impacts the shutdown is having. So any other questions on the financial report?
Any questions for Craig?
I don't have a question, but a statement.
Okay, go.
Thanks, Craig. That's great. The forecast, the reason I'm interested in the actual versus the forecast is really to let our voters know that the budget deficit we're in is real, that it has some very good numbers behind it. It's got some great forecasting, and our actuals are backing up that forecast. And so, the numbers that we're looking at this year and for the next 3 to 5 years are numbers that, that's some actual data. And we've got very competent staff, yourself and your financial staff, that is helping to come up with those numbers. And that, we're looking for different ways to solve that budget shortage. And we need the state to help us do that. But our great confidence in our financial staff.
Thanks, Russ. I agree. Any other questions or comments for Craig? Okay, thanks, Craig. And that moves us on to bond and hail updates. And Scott Ryder, Executive Director of Facilities, will provide updated information about the 2013 Bond and Hail projects, attachments from Cushing Terrell, Conair Engineering, Sandstone and Castle Rock practice fields, and softball dugouts. With that, I will pass it over to Scott Ryder. Mr. Ryder.
Yes, I have to first apologize. I apparently have the worst internet connection ever over here, so I'll try to do my best. Luckily, the majority of this update is from Monday of last week, and I think I went through most all of it then. The only new piece on here, other than that, is the layout for the Castle Rock green space for you to take a look at. There's also an update on a couple projects that we're starting next week. The softball dugouts for Lewis and Clark, Washington, and Castle Rock will begin on the 27th. And we have a pre-bid walkthrough this week. If there's any questions on any of it, I'd be happy to answer, unless you'd like me to go through each one again.
I think you did a really comprehensive job at our Monday meeting. Could you refresh my memory as to when you will be starting the Castle Rock and Sandstone fields?
Well, it was to the board tonight for approval on the consent agenda, so we'll set up a schedule once it's been approved, and then we can give you a schedule on the timeline for that project.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions of Scott that were not addressed last Monday? Looks like you got off pretty easy tonight, Scott. All right, that moves us to the MTSBA update. And what I can share with you about that is we had a board of directors conference call, and they're putting a halt pretty much to all meetings going forward in person. So the June meeting, where we would be having conversations and discussions on the legislative issues, they're looking to figure out how to do that remotely. Travel by board members and staff has all been canceled. They are also not anticipating MCEL, so looking for other virtual connections. They're looking into ways to communicate more effectively with trustees and looking at different platforms that are available. There is some lost revenue because they haven't been able to have their meetings, but they are very fiscally solid. So that's just a current update for MTSBA. And if there are no questions, we'll move on to the next item. All right, the next item is the consent agenda. And in it, as usual, there are, just a moment, I lost my agenda. There we go. Number of things on the agenda are routine in nature. The consent agenda is used to conserve time. The items don't require deliberation on the part of the board. The items will be accepted and approved in one action unless a board member wishes to have an item separated, which they did not. So the suggested action is to approve and accept the items within the consent agenda without objection to the recommended action. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
And who? Joe Raffiani. Motion by Joe Raffiani. And a second?
I'll second.
A second by Jen Hoffman. And I will call for a roll call vote. Joe Raffiani.
Aye.
Michael Leo.
Aye.
Russ Hall.
Aye.
Jana Hafer.
Aye.
Tanya Ludwig. Jennifer Hoffman.
Aye.
Scott McCullough.
Aye.
Brian Yates.
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. And then that leaves us to the comments from the public, communication from the public, and I would like to pass that on to Craig Van Ice. I shared how you can communicate with us at the beginning of the meeting, so I won't repeat that.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So there's one public comment this evening. It's from Kimberly Hattery at 1044 North 25th Street. The comment is, will the school open after the 24th? What about graduation for the kids in 5th grade and also high school seniors? Can we do something special for them? They deserve this attention they have worked so hard for. What about having the senior picture taken and put up in the streets like some states have done. And that's it for public comment. You're on mute, Greta.
Thank you. That moves us to the last item, which is adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved.
Motion by Joe Raffiani and a second
Second.
by Brian Yates. And the roll call, any further discussion? Roll call vote, Joe Raffiani,
Aye.
Michael Leo,
Aye.
Russ Hall,
Aye.
Jana Hafer,
Aye.
Tanya Ludwig, Jen Hoffman,
Aye.
Scott McCullough,
Aye.
Brian Yates,
Aye.
and the board votes chair. We are adjourned. Have a good evening, stay healthy, and stay safe.